4 years ago, my aunt became seriously ill. Since she was no longer young, it is clear that there were no hopes, and the whole family was waiting for the inevitable. Her whole death is shrouded in some mystery that I still haven't solved. And it all started with a strange dream. In my dream, I come to the cemetery to my grandfather, who died 2 years earlier. The dream was as vivid as it was. I went to his grave, and he was sitting with his back to the rest of the cemetery and weaving a wreath of scarlet roses. I sat down on the bench next to him and asked who he was weaving it for. He looked back and pointed into the depths of the cemetery. A fresh grave was dug there, in the place where his mother, my great-grandmother, was buried. I was scared, but I asked anyway who would be buried there. And he lowered his head and wept. I was looking at the grave, and suddenly a light appeared from it. I touched my grandfather's shoulder and asked again. He said she would come to us soon, and she would come to her brothers and sisters. At that time, only Aunt Nina was ill in the family, and she had no sisters. There was a brother, but he is buried very far away. I asked my grandfather, is this a metaphor or is it the way it is? He said he just didn't know anything. I looked at the empty grave in the bright light. 2 children entered it, a boy and a girl, about 7 to 8 years old, no more. When they entered it, I looked at my grandfather, and he said that I would soon dig a grave and bury my soul. That woke me up. 10 minutes after I woke up, my cousin Yuri called and said that Aunt Nina had died. He always called her Aunt Nina, all the way to the village where my aunt lived, my husband, my sisters, and I vividly discussed my dream. What kind of sisters or brothers? Why would I dig a grave, even less bury her? Because the village is full of people who dig graves, no one will refuse for a bottle and grannies at funerals. Soon the fairy tale takes its toll, but it won't end soon. Around 5:00 that day, we found out that no one could dig a grave or bury my aunt. It was not clear why, and that's when it became really scary. All the relatives insisted that she be buried, but no one except me could read Old Slavonic. And where to go, scary or not, but I had to. A father is a father, and traditions cannot be broken. One of the grandmothers found a psalter for me. She told me what to read and how to read it, but she wouldn't give me any money. I was left alone in the house. An aunt in a coffin, candles, icons, and a psalter. To say that it's scary is to say nothing. And okay, anything happens. I'll drink this, it's good for my soul. Calm down. Furthermore, the next day they started looking for gravediggers. No one agreed. We had money problems at that time, and the prices set by those who agreed to dig the grave were too much for us. There's nothing to do. We had to dig ourselves out. And then the dream became clear. When we went to the cemetery in the village, it turned out that she could only be buried in the grave of her grandmother, my grandfather's mother. They started digging my brother-in-law, my sister's husband, and his friend, and found 2 old coffins. In them were the bodies of 2 children, a girl with long hair and a boy with 7 to 8 years old. And it was her brother and sister, true cousins. Everyone has already forgotten about them. They burned down in an old hut back in the late 30s. They were the first to be buried in this grave. Then their grandmother came to them, but over 40 years had passed, and by that time there was no sign of their grave. And no one but me agreed to bury my aunt. So the dream came true. She went to her brothers and sisters, literally. I dug the grave myself, celebrated it, and I buried it myself. This could be called a game of imagination because my aunt was very sick and I thought she would soon die. I changed my daily experiences to Morpheus. But no one knew or remembered about these children. I had never heard of them before, and no photos of them have been preserved in any archive. They were simply forgotten about. And why no one agreed to dig her grave and bury her, even after 3 years, I cannot understand. Mike leaned back in his chair in surprise. Aunt Margaret looked at him carefully and shook her head. What? Have you heard that voice again? Yes, the guy replied, not understanding why he couldn't go out and talk to the person who called him. Because it's not human, she replied to his thoughts. Didn't you listen well? There are only old people left in our village. They don't walk at night. They stay at home. There are no other people for miles around. What do you mean? Not a person. The guy was surprised. It wasn't the mosquitoes buzzing my name so amicably. Someone was calling, maybe mosquitoes. You're not the first to hear this, my aunt replied, chuckling to herself as she wound the yarn around his hands again, as if tying them with strong woolen threads. Many people here heard a voice outside the fence, left and did not return. In our city, this is called mysticism. and no one believes in it, but here it is a common thing. Soon the mermaid will be a week old, so they are raging, calling people who do not believe in anything. Now is their time. They are in force. So it's better not to go anywhere after sunset. It's calmer that way. And if you need to go to the bathroom? Not believing in the reality of what was said, the guy grinned, deciding that the hostess was playing a prank on him. "I'll put a bucket here," she replied seriously. "I'll cover it with plywood, and don't forget that the door is locked from the inside." She always sat at our entrance. An ordinary grandmother, a blouse, a rag bag, old glasses. I remember Anya from childhood. She lived alone. We never saw any of her relatives. We did not go to visit her. She didn't even have a cat. But in the morning she sat at the entrance and so on until the evening. She didn't knit, didn't read magazines, and wasn't particularly friendly with other old ladies. No one loved Grandma Anya because old Anya had a loud voice and eternal advice. Nikolai, our neighbor, comes out of the entrance on Sunday morning. He worked as a locksmith. The old woman, Anya, shouts at him, "Nicholas, a beer or something. You don't need vodka." Then Nicholas waves it off. "What's going to happen to me?" Or the beautiful Maria passes by from the second entrance. Miniskirt, scarlet lipstick, black heels. Old Anya said to her, "Maria, are you going on a date again? With this guy?" "Don't, Maria. He's a bad man." Maria turns around abruptly. "Am I asking you or Ivan, my older friend?" Starts his moped. He was about 17 years old at the time. He stole a moped somewhere. We all knew that, but we were silent. The old woman, Anya, said to him, "Well, stop talking here. Move your legs. Do you hear that?" But Ivan started the engine even more violently, and it was not audible that the old woman was shouting further. Old Anya also clung to me, but rarely. "Ludwig, you need to exercise. You're loitering around like a fool." I would have run. It's good for the heart. I didn't want to seem rude to Anya, so I nodded and quickly walked on. The years passed. I was growing up. The driver, Ivan, started drinking even more after his wife left him. But he, the boar, really had nothing. Maria married her blockhead, and she was terribly pleased. The 90s had already begun. Her husband became a bandit, buying her huge gold rings and earrings. Then they moved into a new large apartment. Nicholas had already driven a used BMW, which was also said to have been stolen. I got married and had a son. And old Anya was still sitting on the bench. She hasn't changed at all. The same faded blouse, the same glasses, the same loud voice. And she also pestered everyone who passed by with stupid advice. But she suddenly fell in love with my son. Sometimes he would sit with her on the bench and she would tell him something, surprisingly quietly. When my son was about 5 years old, he suddenly came from the street and told us everyone should listen to Grandma Anya. We laughed, of course. We only listened to her. And then we moved out of the area. But my friends from our yard sometimes called me and told me the news. Nicholas crashed to his death in his boomer. Maria and her husband died during a gang fight. And Ivan the boar went outside one morning, took a beer with vodka, sat down in the kitchen at home, took a sip, and died. He was only 54 years old. ... 15 years had passed. I suddenly decided to return to the courtyard of my youth. I had a slight nostalgia. Yes, there are no more childhood friends left, but like this to take a walk, to remember, to be a little sad. The yard has changed, but not much, except that a new playground has appeared. But most importantly, old Anya was sitting at the entrance, still the same. I was surprised it couldn't be, but it was her. I asked, "Do you recognize me?" She chuckled, "Of course. I noticed you right away. Well done for coming. How is your heart?" And I remembered her stupid advice. "Listen," I say, "but you were right. I've had a few seizures. The doctors advised me to run in the morning. I'm running." And then I remembered everything she had shouted to us then, a long time ago, Maria, Ivan, Nicholas, and I felt a little scared. "Grandma, who are you anyway?" She straightened her blouse. "Don't you understand yet? Your son understood everything right away, a smart guy. I am death. Yes, and I was sitting here to warn you fools, but no one listens to Grandma." I heard this story almost 30 years ago from my great-uncle, with whom I spent the winter holidays. Even then, I was interested in anything unusual. I eagerly listened to stories, whether true or not, from people I knew, their parents and friends. Grandfather never joked about such topics and very rarely told anything about the war. Therefore, I believed in his story immediately and unconditionally, and I continue to believe in it to this day. The only thing I regret is that I didn't remember where they were. I think they were Polish lands on the border with Germany. The story of the grandfather literary treatment from the author. Almost all the guys we ran with died. We, the 4 survivors, made our way to the nearest villages through undergrowth and swamps, over rough terrain. It got dark, and we all walked, almost groping, from time to time, calling softly to each other so as not to get lost. At first, I thought I could see light ahead and far to the left, but after almost 2 days without sleep and rest, my eyesight could also fail. But my best friend Alexander, the man with the sharpest eyesight, screamed briefly, pointing at the light. "Look, we're almost there." Holding hands, without wasting any more words or breath, we wandered to where a tiny yellow light was flickering. It seemed like an eternity, and a couple of seconds had passed at the same time. The light turned into a small window, from which a soft yellow light poured. In front of us towered a sturdy log house, obviously of ancient construction. Walking around it, we found ourselves on a small porch. They stood up and knocked on the wooden door, listening to the dark night. In the distance, they could hear the faint barking of search engines. Holding hands, wasting no more words or breath, we trudged to where a tiny yellow light was flickering. It seemed like an eternity had passed, and at the same time a couple of seconds. The lantern turned into a small window, from which a soft yellow light poured. In front of us towered a sturdy log house, obviously of ancient construction. Walking around it, we found ourselves on a small porch. We stood up and knocked on the wooden door, listening to the dark night. We could hear the faint barking of search dogs in the distance. We were definitely being chased, no matter how much we wanted to believe that we had lost the chase after all. The door opened and I closed my eyes for a couple of seconds. The light seemed very bright to me after almost total darkness. The woman who opened the door was not too young. She wore an old-fashioned dress and an apron tied with a handkerchief. She looked at us carefully, then stepped aside, silently inviting us to enter the house. When we entered, she bolted the door open. Demir, a good man Bashkir, our unofficial supervisor, pushed Henrik forward. He was the youngest of us, a guy from the home army who joined our squad a month ago. Henrik spoke to the woman in Polish, asking for permission to stay the night. The woman, still silent, brought several blankets, put them against the wall, pointed at them, and went back to the bench, next to which was a hand-spinning wheel. She sat down and began to thread. The candle was burning, giving off a dim light. Outside the walls of the hut, the barking of the dogs and the roll call of the Germans could be heard more and more clearly. But the fear didn't seem to go away. We lay side by side on the blankets, feeling like we were falling into a deep, deep sleep. When we woke up, we realized that something was wrong. The autumn sky above us was overcast, and the wind carried the smell of damp earth and withered grass. Someone screamed nearby. I sat up, trying to figure out where I was. But when we woke up, we realized that something was wrong. The autumn sky above us was overcast, and the wind carried the smell of damp earth and withered grass. Someone screamed nearby. I sat up, trying to figure out where I was. But it took me a long time to realize that we were lying on dirty cloths on the ground. Jesus, Mary. Henrik exhaled in a trembling voice. He crossed himself. His face was white as chalk. That was understandable. We were sitting right on someone's grave, topped at the head with a lopsided stone cross, and the blankets and bedding were scraps of a shroud. At that moment, Grandpa fell silent. I sat as still as a mouse, feeling goosebumps running through my body. Even then, I wasn't scared. But I was thankful to this woman, who owned the grave and the cloak, who protected the living on her land and saved them. In 2011, I shared an apartment with a friend. It was a 3-room apartment in an ordinary 5-story panel house. Victoria was my friend's name. Her father, who worked in shifts, sometimes stayed in the room at night, and I lived alone. Therefore, because of the larger area, she got the hall, and I got the bedroom. The area was very nice, not a bad spot. The neighbors were mostly quiet old people who danced to the accordion in the evenings right next to our door, without bothering anyone. In general, the house is like a house. Everything is peaceful, orderly, calm. We lived there for about a year, and nothing special happened there. There was no oppressive atmosphere, no rustling. There was only one case that I want to tell you about. There was no furniture in this apartment. I decided not to change the room because I didn't know how long I would stay there. The hostess of the room was moody and sometimes made me mad with her silly statements about small things. I bought only a clothes rack, an air mattress, and, in fact, everything. There was one window in the room and a battery under it. I put a mattress on top of the battery to make it warmer in winter and cooler in summer. A thin, transparent organza tulle hung on the window. There was a street lamp outside the window, so the room was well lit at night, but it did not make it hard to sleep. It was winter. I woke up in the middle of the night for no reason. No feelings, I just opened my eyes and lay for a few minutes looking at the battery. The ticking of the clock broke the silence, and from time to time the noise of passing cars could be heard. No more sounds. Lying on my side and thinking I could go to the toilet, I turned to face the room and was surprised when I saw a woman squatting right next to the mattress. I still remember what she looks like. Bleached yellow with overgrown dark roots, hair just below the shoulders. Brown eyes, red turtleneck, denim suit. Clearly a marginal nature, an absolutely material woman. She just sat there and looked at me, and I looked at her. The seconds of our acquaintance dragged on until I asked a logical question: who are you? It was more likely to run out of the apartment screaming or jump from the 4th floor, but at that moment there was no fear. I just forgot that I was all alone in the apartment, except for this lady in jeans. Victoria went to the village with her parents. Well, that's it. I didn't get an answer to my question. Instead, the woman began to smile. Like in stupid horror movies, slowly stretching his lips, exposing a gaping void. She had no teeth in her mouth. In dim light, it looked like just a black spot on pale skin. And then I behaved even more illogically. I stood on the mattress facing the window, with my back to her. I started to wonder who would be wandering around here if the doors were closed, especially the windows. I didn't hear any extraneous sounds because I slept very lightly. Additionally, the floors in my room creaked wildly even under the weight of the child, and under the weight of an adult they will creak even more. There were many questions, unlike fear. Until I remembered that I was home alone. Then it dawned on me. My heart sank into my lower abdomen. I felt weak. I wanted to howl in fear. I experienced all this range of emotions in a few seconds. I didn't know what to do next, so I quickly turned away from the window, ready to die. But the room was empty. Let me remind you, just a hanger and a mattress, and I'm scared, and no one else, and no footsteps, no creaking, no sound of the door opening, nothing. As soon as she appeared, she immediately disappeared. It was about 4 a.m. on the clock. I couldn't sleep anymore. I sat in the kitchen, listened to the sounds, and thought after that, I didn't ask anyone about the history of this apartment. I only told my friend. But she hadn't seen anything like it. Neither before nor after, and I moved out soon after. And yet, no one has ever addressed me like that.